Since producing our first ABC of Southern Railway locomotives over 50 years ago, the publishing company, which emanated from that first modest publication, has produced and distributed over 100 million copies of books and magazines on transport subjects. And to this we're adding an ever-increasing number of video programs. This is the fourth in a series of 4 programs outlining the history of British railways, illustrated by a fascinating variety of archive film from the 1930s to 70s, together with contemporary scenes.
Our programme takes us from the very roots of passenger railways to the end of the story, at least for now, of British railways. The very first passenger railway in the world opened on the 25th of March 1807 in South Wales. This was the Oystermouth Railway, later renamed the Swansea and the Mumbles Railway. Here we see it in its last days as it closed in 1962. In its time, it had used many different forms of locomotion, ending with tramcars, after the use of steam, sails, and horses. Horses were the first form of motive power on railways, and were used on the earliest railways, which were private lines built to serve collieries and quarries. Among the pioneers of these in Wales was the Nantlle Railway, incorporated on the 20th of May 1825, to build a tramway from the copper mines and slate quarries in the Vale of Nantlle to Pen y Groes and north to the quays at Caernarfon on the Menai Strait. The line was engineered by George Stephenson and his brother Robert, and laid to the unusual gauge of 3 feet 6 inches. Although part of the line was converted to standard gauge and incorporated in a later railway, the final mile or so at the eastern end at Talesaun remained horse-worked to the end, passing as such into British Railways ownership, as seen in these views in the early 1950s. Horses were used by many railways well into the 20th century for shunting purposes. The history of railways in the northwest of Wales is tied in with the development of the various mining activities. A little to the north of the Nantlle Railway were 2 of the largest slate quarries in the world, the Penrhyn at Bethesda and the Dinorwic alongside Llyn Padarn. In 1824, a tram road was built over the mountains to Port Dinorwic, also on the Menai Strait. This used inclined planes and was to 2-foot gauge, using horsepower. The inclines were troublesome, so in 1843 a new line of 4-foot gauge was built along the shores of Llyn Padarn. This was known as the Padarn Railway, and it was used to transport the slate to Port Dinorwic, adopting steam locomotion in 1849. In the quarries themselves, an ever-changing network of lines was required as the quarries were expanded. To service this, a narrow-gauge 1-foot 10 3/4-inch system was used, which from the mid-1880s employed a large fleet of small steam shunting engines, most of which were built by the Leeds firm of Hunslet. Many survive today in preservation. The slate railways of North Wales were to be the foundation of the railway preservation movement that is responsible for much of the interest in railways today, and its origins are now part of the history of railways themselves. The first preserved line was the Llyn, and the second the Festiniog Railway. We will look at the latter first, as its own origins were earlier, and it was the first narrow-gauge railway to use steam traction. These scenes date from the 1950s, when the line was rescued by preservationists. This is Prince, the second oldest 2-foot gauge steam locomotive in the world. The Festiniog was opened in 1836 to transport slate from the quarries at Blaen and Festiniog to a new harbour at Porthmadog. It was engineered by James Spooner and used horses in its early days, with loaded slate wagons being allowed to run down the line by gravity. Such was its success that slate output grew from 18,000 tonnes in 1835 to nearly 90,000 tonnes 30 years later, at the time steam was introduced. Within a year of the arrival of the steam locomotives, the railway commenced carrying passengers and pioneered the use of bogie coaches on the narrow gauge. The Festiniog was something of a celebrity even in the 19th century. It was seen as an example to be followed throughout the British Empire, as narrow-gauge railways could be used to open up countries where there was a need for cheap lines for small amounts of traffic. The same concept was adopted by the military authorities to enable them to lay railways quickly during warfare. One of the Festiniog's most famous breakthroughs was the introduction of the renowned double-ended Fairlie locomotives, which were able to deliver a great amount of power on the narrow gauge. The first Fairlie, Little Wonder, was delivered in 1869 and demonstrated to the Board of Trade and foreign dignitaries in 1870. Amongst the foreign delegations was one from the Russian Empire, who was so impressed that the Tsar awarded Charles Spooner, son of James, a gold medallion and silver shield. In the 20th century, the slate trade fell away rapidly and the Welsh narrow-gauge lines had to rely increasingly on the tourist market. However, this was unable to sustain them, and by the end of the Second World War, most were virtually bankrupt. One of the earliest to close was the Talyllyn Railway, a 2-foot 3-inch gauge line opened in 1867 to transport both passengers and slate to Towyn on the Cambrian coast. It closed in 1950, but was immediately taken over by the First Railway Preservation Society and reopened in time for the 1951 season. To the south of the Talyllyn is a very different narrow-gauge line, the last to survive in British Railways ownership. This is the Vale of Rheidol Railway, a 20th century creation designed very much with the tourist trade in mind, as well as to act as a freight line. It opened in 1902 from Aberystwyth to the well-known tourist attraction of Devil's Bridge, and is one of the few narrow-gauge lines still to be functioning for its original purpose today. As with most small railways, the freight traffic ceased early, in this case during the First World War, just before which the Vale of Rheidol had been sold to the Cambrian Railways. As such, it was acquired by the Great Western Railway at the grouping in 1923, that railway developing the tourist traffic in the 1920s and 1930s. Locomotives and stock were augmented or replaced by new construction at Swindon, and the line passed into the hands of British Railways in 1948. It continued to function throughout the British Railways era, and in 1968 the 3 locomotives became the last steam engines to be owned and operated by British Rail. Other than changes to the liveries, the line continued to work for British Rail until the end of 1988, when it was sold to a private operator. This was the first example of privatisation of any part of British Rail, and also the true end of steam for the nationalised business. Narrow-gauge lines serving quarries and mines were not unknown in other parts of the United Kingdom, but they were especially associated with North Wales. 2 other lines deserve attention. The first is another which passed through the hands of the Cambrian Railways, the Great Western and British Railways. The story of the Welsh Pool and Llanfair Light Railway is a contrast to the Vale of Rheidol, as although it was also opened at the turn of the century, in 1903, it was built partly on the formation of a very much earlier tramway, dating from 1818, and goods traffic was its principal trade. Indeed, passenger traffic ceased in 1931, but the goods traffic kept it in business until 1956, when British Railways closed it. Preservation followed, the line reopening to tourists in 1963. Our final narrow-gauge line is one built entirely for tourism. The Snowdon Mountain Railway is unique in the British Isles for its use of the rack system to gain adhesion on severe gradients. It utilises Swiss locomotives and stock to reach the summit of Snowdon and was opened in 1896. We will now turn to the standard gauge railways of Wales. By far the most important lines are the South Wales and North Wales Coast main lines, running from east to west. The North Wales Coast Line is one of the earliest lines of all, its origins going back to the first trunk route, the Grand Junction. The first part was the Chester and Crewe Railway, which opened in 1840 and created the Great Junction Station at Crewe. The Irish mails traffic was the great prize, and a main line from Holyhead to link with the Chester and Crewe became the goal. The Chester and Holyhead Railway was approved in 1844, just before the Railway Mania, and construction took place throughout the rest of the decade, formal opening taking place in 1850. Its most notable features were the two tubular bridges over the River Conwy and the Menai Strait, built to the design of Robert Stephenson. The railway was worked by the London and North Western Railway from the outset, becoming part of that railway in 1859. It was built along the sea coast for virtually all of its length, and the LNWR proceeded to promote the tourist aspects of the coastal towns. Resorts such as Llandudno, which was served by a mainline branch opened in 1858, Rhyl and Prestatyn owe their growth to the LNWR, which provided them with fast, frequent services, together with holiday trains from the industrial towns of the Midlands and North West. 3 different railways were to serve the Cambrian coast. The Great Western Railway had reached the northeastern corner of Wales with its Shrewsbury and Chester Railway. The Great Western was to consolidate its position in the area and reach out towards the Cambrian coast with a cross-country railway through the Vale of Llangollen and the Dee Valley. This opened from Rweben to Llangollen in 1862 and throughout to a junction with the Cambrian Railway at Dolgellau in 1869. This gave it access to the line which served Barmouth, the principal coastal town on the western seaboard. The Barmouth Viaduct, crossing the Mowddach estuary, is probably the best-known feature of the Cambrian Coast Line, and was completed in 1867. The Cambrian coastline, running from Machynlleth to Pwllheli, was notable for its tortuous route alongside the Dyfi estuary. The line was originally conceived as a coastal route to Aberystwyth, but the cost of crossing the River Dyfi at its seaward end was prohibitive, and the Aberystwyth and Welsh Coast Railway, which had been formed to build the line, changed its plans and built a line along the northern bank of the estuary to meet its original line from Machynlleth at a newly built station at Dyfi Junction, where a small viaduct could be built. The station at Dyfi Junction achieved fame as it has no road access, being a true railway junction and serving no community. This train, headed by one of the Great Western Earl or Duke Dog class locomotives, is heading over the viaduct with a train for Barmouth. The Aberystwyth and Welsh Coast Railway amalgamated in 1865 with the Cambrian Railways, which had been formed in 1863 from a group of 4 companies that had built a main line through the central Welsh mountains from Whitchurch on the LNWR's Crewe to Shrewsbury line to Machynlleth. The first of these railways was the Llanidloes and Newtown Railway, opened in 1859. 2 further railways extended the line to Welshpool and Oswestry, whilst a 4th railway opened in 1863 to Machynlleth. This made a junction with the Llanidloes and Newtown at Moat Lane Junction, leaving the original line to Llanidloes on a spur. This situation did not last long, however, as a number of railways were being promoted through the centre of Wales to transport coal from the South Wales coalfield to the Midlands. The Mid Wales Railway was opened in 1864 from Llanidloes via Rhyadr and Builth to connect with the Brecon and Merthyr Railway at Tawerllyn Junction. This incorporated one of Wales's earliest railways, the Hay Railway, authorised in 1811 and 1812 as a 24-mile horse tramway between Brecon and Erdesley. It was taken over by the Hereford, Hay and Brecon Railway in 1860, over which the other railways had running powers. A joint station was built at Brecon, opening in 1871. The red brick station building was the headquarters of the Brecon and Merthyr Railway, the first railway to open to the county town in 1863. This was an ambitious undertaking, seeking to provide a link between Brecon and the Bristol Channel. To this end, it built a railway over the Brecon beacons to Merthyr Tydfil. It was authorised in 1858 and had some of the steepest gradients, including a 7-mile stretch of 1 in 38, and the highest tunnel in the UK at Torpantai. Torpantai station was 1,312 feet above sea level. From here, the line dropped down to Dowlais on the northeastern outskirts of Merthyr Tydfil. This was the original terminal of the railway, but its ambitions were still to reach Newport on the Bristol Channel. However, before we follow that part of its history, we must examine the railways of Merthyr Tydfil and Dowlais. The two towns sported 4 great ironworks, that at Dowlais being the largest in the world in the mid-19th century. To serve this important industrial area, no fewer than 6 railways were built. The last but one to arrive was the London and North Western Railway's Heads of the Valley route, which reached Merthyr in 1879. The LNWR had built the railway in stages to tap the coal and iron traffic and effectively provide an alternative network to the many small railways that connected the valley collieries to the Great Western South Wales main line and the great ports at Cardiff and Newport. It shared its access to the heart of Merthyr Tydfil itself with the Brecon and Merthyr Railway, which had built a long sweeping branch from its main line at Pontstickle around the northwestern side of the town to the Vale of Neath's High Street station. One railway served Dowlais alone. The joint Great Western and Rumney Railway branch to Kai Harris opened in 1876. This provided the Great Ironworks with its only direct connection to Cardiff, and the line was to survive the closure of the ironworks in 1987, remaining to serve the last colliery in the area at Cwm Bargoed. The line was worked as a Great Western branch, as were many of the South Wales railways after the grouping in 1923. The Great Western produced a special series of tank locomotives to work in the coalfields, and these were to set the characteristic style of South Wales railways in the middle 20th century. Amongst the lines absorbed by the GWR was the Brecon and Merthyr, which had completed its route to Newport via Dowlais Top and a railway through Fochryw to join the Rumney Railway in the Rumney Valley. It incorporated one of the earliest railways in South Wales, the original Rumney Tramway, which opened in 1826. This connected to the very first line of all, the Monmouthshire Railway and Canal Company, incorporated in 1792 to build a tram road from the Sirhowy Valley to a canal from Pontypool to Newport. The tramway opened in 1805 and connected to another tramway, the Sirhowy Tram Road, that was incorporated in 1802 as only the third railway ever sanctioned by Parliament. The 3 tram roads, Rumney, Monmouthshire and Sirhowy, proved very successful. However, they were not proper railways, and by the 1850s were unable to compete with the later lines. They belatedly tried to convert themselves into railways, but all 3 had to be taken over by the major railways. The Rumney by the Brecon and Merthyr, the Monmouthshire by the Great Western in 1875, and the Sirhowy by the LNWR in 1876. This This acquisition finally gave the LNWR independent entry to the rich mining valleys, and the former Sir Howie became the North Western's most southerly line in Wales. It made an end-on junction with the Great Western's former Monmouthshire line at 9 Mile Point. The abiding image of the South Wales Railways is that of long coal trains headed by Great Western tank engines. There were, in effect, 3 major areas: the Newport Valleys, the Cardiff Valleys, and the Swansea Valleys. Many of the valleys were served by more than one railway company, and at the time of grouping of the railways in 1923, 16 separate railway companies were handed over to the Great Western. Many ran parallel to one another in the same valley. There were holding sidings at most points, and numerous small stations served mining communities and the ubiquitous colliery systems. The Western Valleys and the Vale of Glamorgan between Cardiff and Swansea were dominated by the Great Western even before the grouping, and a number of busy junctions enabled trains to be routed either to the east or to the west. Triangular junctions existed at both Bryn Melyn and Tondee, serving the Rhondda. The lines had been built to the broad gauge to connect with the South Wales main line, opening in 1861. And by the 1870s, the Garw and Ogmore valleys were served by further branches. 2 other railways served the Vale of Glamorgan, the Barry Railway and the Taff Vale. These are 2 of the most famous of the South Wales railways. Although they competed fiercely with one another, the various South Wales railways developed along very similar lines. These locomotives from the Taff Vale and Rumney railways exhibit certain Great Western features which were applied after the 1923 grouping, such as the standard Great Western boilers, cabs and bunkers. They are all 062 tanks, which have become the preferred locomotive layout for the railways. In addition to these railways, the Port Talbot, the Cardiff, the Barry, the Alexandra Docks and the Brecon and Merthyr railways produced broadly similar locomotives. The Great Western, in a break from its standardisation policy, produced a special series of locomotives, the Class 5600 062 tanks, to replace the South Wales engines as they became due for renewal. These engines are seen in Cardiff Docks, at the heart of the coal industry in the 1930s. Cardiff owes its present size to the railways. At the beginning of the railway age, it was little more than a village. In 1834, the village's customs officer did not expect coal to ever be exported from the dock here, as the cost of transportation from the coal fields would be too expensive. Cardiff's first railway was the Taff Vale, which opened in 1841, and thereafter the village grew into one of the greatest ports and cities in the United Kingdom. The second railway to serve Cardiff arriving in 1850. This was the broad gauge South Wales Railway, a Great Western ally, and soon to become that railway's South Wales main line. The Rumney was the third railway to serve Cardiff, opening in 1857. The LNWR, the Barry Railway and the Cardiff Railway were also to feed the expanding port, from which some of the finest coal in the world was exported to feed the British Empire. A monument to the importance of coal in Cardiff's economy was the magnificent Coal Exchange, where coal prices were quoted and coal bought and sold in the same way as shares or other commodities were traded in the stock and commodity exchanges in London. The main line of the South Wales Railway was to connect the industrial and commercial centres of South Wales to the main British system through its association with the Great Western Railway. It reached Swansea in the same year, 1850, as it reached Cardiff, and 2 years later extended westwards to Llanelli. The South Wales main line was conceived to handle traffic for both Ireland and the transatlantic trade, and opened through to Neyland in 1856. Various railways in the district were promoted to further this trade, to Milford Haven, Pembroke Dock, and finally in 1906, Fishgood Harbour. These lines remain today, and in 1993, steam specials were run to all of them as part of the celebrations to mark 125 years of the LNWR's Central Wales Railway. Before we examine the present-day story of railways in Wales, we must turn back the clock to trace the story of railways in Scotland, starting in the country's capital city, Edinburgh, where tramcars in the 1930s brought passengers along the famous Princes Street to Waverley Station, approached by train through the cutting-in Princes Street Gardens, owned by the North British Railway. The very names of these Scott and Glen Class 440s and the magnificent Atlantics proclaim the Scots heritage of the North British. While small tank engines and passenger engines fuss about at the southern end of the great station, we can recall the origins of this great railway, the largest of the Scottish lines and fifth largest in the United Kingdom, after the LNWR, Midland, Great Western and North Eastern. The North British itself was authorised as late as 1844, but it soon took over the first railway in Edinburgh, the Edinburgh and Dalkeith. This was opened in 1831 using horse power to a terminus on the south side of Arthur's Seat, which dominates the southern part of the city. As with most early railways, this was built to bring coal to the city centre, but within a year of opening, it also opened its line to passengers, on the initiative of one Michael Fox, a successful coal merchant, who put a stagecoach on the rails and soon built a thriving passenger business. The railway offered its own passenger services soon after, and expanded its operations in the city to Edinburgh's port at Leith, opening there in 1838. Edinburgh always had an intensive suburban system thereafter. These North Eastern Railway locomotives have worked in over the original main line of the North British. The North British was founded in 1844 to build the trunk line from Edinburgh to the border at Berwick-on-Tweed, to form the Scottish end of the East Coast Main Line. It was opened in 1846 with a new station at Waverley in the Princes Street Gardens. North British expansion resulted in a monopoly of the southeastern part of Scotland and the border counties. By 1862, it had opened a second trunk route to the south, across the hills to Carlisle. This was the Waverley route, but it was never really successful and was closed in 1969. To the north of Edinburgh, the North British had its eye on Aberdeen. Its great rival, the Caledonian Railway, which we will see shortly, was the first to reach the Granite City. The North British had to be content with lines running along the two great firths of the Tay and the Forth. These two great river estuaries were to delay the North British's provision of direct services to Aberdeen until the end of the 19th century, when two of the greatest engineering feats of the Victorian era were to complete the East Coast Main Line. The first of the two bridges to be completed was that over the River Tay. The one on which we see green arrow was the second to be built. Alongside can be seen the bases of the piers of the first to be built between 1871 and 1878 to the design of the then famous engineer Sir Thomas Barch. Its subsequent collapse 13 months after its opening is one of the greatest disasters to have befallen the railways of Britain. A second Tay Bridge was opened in June 1887 and was the longest railway bridge in Europe, at 2 miles 364 yards long. The first bridge was single line, but this one carries a double line of rails. This particular train was run to celebrate its centenary. Although after 2 attempts the Tay had been mastered, there still remained a gap in the North British's main line to Aberdeen. Trains from the south had to offload their passengers on the banks of the River Forth at South Queensferry for the river crossing by boat. This problem was tackled by the provision of one of the greatest bridges of all time, and what is probably the symbol of Scottish railways to all people, the Forth Bridge. The magnificent 1 mile, 1,006-yard long Forth Bridge has always been known as one of the railway wonders of the world. Designed by John Fowler and Benjamin Baker, it was built by William Arrol and opened in 1890, thus completing the East Coast route. This set off a series of railway races to the north and brought out the full competitive spirit in the North British and Caledonian railways. The train here is another centenary special. Statistics and details are awe-inspiring. For example, it has 6.5 million rivets in it, weighing over 4,000 tons on their own. Painting the Forth Bridge has become a familiar saying, but it actually uses 56 tons or so of paint to do it. Scotland's second city is, of course, Glasgow. The railway history of the city is very complicated. It was ultimately to be served by three great railways, the North British, the Caledonian and the Glasgow and South Western. Each had its own terminus in the city, the Caledonian having two. But this is St Enoch terminus, hub of the Glasgow and South Western Railway. Our views were filmed in 1931, when the GSWR was a part of the LMS railway. It had a long history and included the first railway in Scotland among its parts. This was the Kilmarnock and Troon Railway, authorised in 1808 and opened in 1812. Built to a 4-foot gauge, it was another of the early railways serving a coalfield. It was worked by horses and remained independent until 1899. The Glasgow and South Western itself was formed in 1850 as a result of the amalgamation of two companies which dominated Ayrshire and Dumfries, which had got together to promote a trunk route between Scotland and England. The line via Kilmarnock and Dumfries opened in that year, 2 years after its bitter rival, the Caledonian Railway, had opened its trunk route via Beatock. These two railways' rivalry was to dominate the scene south of Glasgow. The Glasgow and South Western's routes lay in the Glasgow, Paisley, Kilmarnock and Ayr Railway, opened in 1839. With rich mineral traffic from the Ayrshire coalfields and intense suburban passenger traffic from the southwestern suburbs, the South-West, as it was generally known, was a major Scottish railway. During its days of independence, it cooperated with the Midland Railway when it opened its Settle and Carlisle line in 1876 to provide Anglo-Scottish expresses from St Enoch to St Pancras via Leeds, Sheffield and Leicester. However, after the grouping in 1923, when the South-West and the Caledonian became part of the LMS, that railway promoted the West Coast Main Line via Crewe and the Caledonian Main Line as the principal Anglo-Scottish route. This process continued into British Railways days, and both the Settle and Carlisle and Glasgow and South Western main lines were downgraded to secondary routes. The Caledonian is perhaps the best-known Scottish railway. Its very name means Scotland, and its central trunk route from Glasgow to Carlisle via the Great Climb over Beatock is the West Coast Main Line of today. The company was formed in 1845, and it comes as a surprise to learn that it was actually an English railway, initially mooted in 1836 by the Grand Junction Railway and surveyed by Joseph Locke. Due to the attention being given to English railway expansion, the proposal took some while to come to fruition. But when the Caledonian was formed, it was designed to serve both Glasgow and Edinburgh as the northern part of a trunk line from London via the Midlands and West Coast. Its locomotives were distinctive, and despite its origins, it proclaimed itself as the Scottish National Line. It adopted a magnificent blue livery, which is displayed today on this preserved Caledonian goods engine. Scottish engineering has a long history, and the railways of Scotland developed a very distinctive style which appeared on the locomotives of 4 of the Big Five railways. This is largely the result of one of the great Scottish engineering families, the Drummonds. The brothers Dugald and Peter managed the locomotive affairs at important times in Scottish railway development. Dugald with the North British and Caledonian Railways, and Peter with the Highland and Glasgow and South Western Railways. Dugald Drummond despite being a strict disciplinarian, produced very stylish locomotives, and his style was followed by his successors, including the production of 060 goods engines right through to 1909. This engine being one of the Macintosh 812 class, the final development of Drummond's original jumbo goods of 1883. Drummond later moved to England and introduced his style to the London and South Western Railway, whose black motors were virtually a copy of the jumbos. The locomotive is actually working on the Strathspey Railway, the only preserved Scottish main line, once the Highland Railway's main line to Inverness, to which we will return. The Caledonian Railway, on the completion of its main line to the south, embarked on further expansion to the north of Glasgow, as well as building an extensive suburban system around the city. Its west coast trunk route ran to Glasgow Central, whilst its second terminus, Glasgow Buchanan Street, provided internal Scottish services to Edinburgh, Aberdeen and Inverness, the latter via connections with the Highland Railway at Perth. In this part of the country, its rival was the North British, particularly for the services to Edinburgh and Aberdeen. The railway to Aberdeen was constructed by 3 separate companies, which later amalgamated with the Caledonian to form a continuous route from the south. These were promoted during the mania year of 1845. The first, the Scottish Central, reaching Perth in 1848. The others completing the line to Aberdeen in 1850. These were the first railways in the northern part of Scotland and started the process of opening up the region. With Aberdeen about to be put on the railway map, Inverness, the capital of the Highlands and key to the whole of the northwest of Scotland, was the next objective. The first proposals also came in the mania year of 1845, but a direct route to Inverness from Perth failed to obtain parliamentary approval. This was because its proposed gradients were too steep for the locomotives of the day, and to the success of the Great North of Scotland Railway, which was approved to build a railway from Aberdeen to Inverness via Huntly and Elgin. With its locomotive headquarters at Inverurie, the Great North was to fail in its objective of reaching Inverness. The project to build a 108-mile line had to be cut back to Keith, a distance of only 52 miles from Aberdeen. This was due to the shortage of money as a reaction to the railway mania. It took the Great North of Scotland until 1856 to open as far as Keith, during which time the citizens of Inverness, anxious for a railway, had promoted an independent company, the Inverness and Nairn Railway, with the expectation of joining the Great North at Nairn. This also opened in 1856, but the Great North's failure meant that a further company, the Inverness and Aberdeen Junction, had to build a line to connect the two railways, opening between Nairn and Keith in 1858, and at last giving Inverness a through railway. Although the Great North of Scotland was to expand in northeast Scotland, absorbing small local companies which enabled it to serve Lossiemouth, Banff, Macduff, Fraserburgh and Peterhead on the coast, its early difficulties were to shape its future importance as a purely regional railway. The working agreement with the Inverness and Aberdeen Junction was never satisfactory, and this was exasperated by the Great North's lack of a direct connection to the railways to the south at Aberdeen. Although it had been planned to amalgamate with the Aberdeen Railway and build a joint station there, the financial difficulties had made the Great North build its terminus at Kitty Brewster, 1.5 miles from the city centre, to avoid the great expense of a railway through the city. This resulted in delays when passengers travelling from Inverness to the south had to change trains and travel across the city. Working practices made things worse, as the Aberdeen Railway would often bring its trains in late from the south. The Great North would wait for the mails to be transferred and then depart. If passengers had been unable to cross the city as quickly, they would be left behind. This, not surprisingly, led to unrest amongst Inverness citizens. The result was the promotion of a direct railway over the Grampians from Perth, similar to the 1845 proposals, which had been rejected because of the steep gradients. By the 1860s, technology had moved on, and 1 in 70 gradients and a 1,500-foot summit were no longer so formidable. The Inverness and Perth Junction Railway was promoted, opening in 1863 between Stanley Junction, a little to the north of Perth, and Forres, approximately halfway along the Inverness and Aberdeen Junctions line. The new main line, with its summit at Drumachta, 1,484 feet above sea level, was to cross virtually uninhabited countryside, the result of the infamous Highland clearances of the previous century. This summit was the highest on a British standard gauge railway, and it was to have a distinct influence on the types of locomotives built for the Highland Railway. In the 1890s, a cut-off line was built from Aviemore to Inverness, with gradients of 1 in 60 and a further summit at Schlocht. This reduced the status of the original Strathspey line, on which we saw the Caledonian engine, to a secondary status and, ultimately, preservation. The hub of the Highland Railway system was Inverness, where its administrative headquarters were situated. It also established its locomotive works here and built its reputation for powerful locomotives. Its first locomotive superintendent was William Barclay, succeeded in 1865 by William Stradley, who was to achieve fame when he moved to the London, Brighton and South Coast Railway 4 years later. His chief assistant, David Jones, succeeded him. Jones was to set the tone of the Highland during his tenure of office from 1870 to 1896. He produced a number of characteristic designs, which included his double-cased chimneys with louvers to assist in the lifting of the exhaust above the locomotive. He is best remembered, however, for his big goods 460 engines, the first of that wheel arrangement to be produced in Great Britain. The 15 locomotives were built by Sharp Stewart & Co. in Glasgow in 1894. When Jones retired, as the result of an accident testing a new locomotive, he was succeeded by Peter Drummond, who remained on the Highland until his appointment to the Glasgow and South Western in 1912. Drummond followed Jones's big engine policy and produced the Castle Class 460s as well as a number of 440 types such as the large Benz. The Castles were very successful and were repeated by his successors Frederick Smith and Christopher Cumming. The former tried to expand the big engine policy, but his River Class 460s were too heavy for the Highland and were rejected by the chief civil engineer. The Rivers were sold to the Caledonian, and Smith retired. Cumming completed the Highland locomotive story with his Clan Class 460s, which were as successful as their forebears. All these scenes were recorded at Inverness, at which the carriage and wagon workshops were also located. Under the LMS, which absorbed the Highland at the grouping in 1923, the famous Stanier Black Fives took the 460 story to its logical conclusion, and these machines became the standard locomotives to work on the Highland lines. In 1993, one of them returned there, passing the old locomotive works to the right of our picture. The train is heading east, along the earliest part of the Highland system. But the railway was also to conquer the wilder outposts of the Highlands to the north and west. Another Black Five is seen in British Railways days on the far north line at Helmsdale, where former Great Western pannier tanks had replaced the Highland 044 tanks, which worked one of its branches to Dornoch from the Mound. And this was part of the process of replacement of Highland locomotive types with standard LMS engines, which continued internationalisation under British Railways. Diesels appeared very early on, and by 1961, steam was virtually eliminated north of Inverness. George Mass Junction was the most northerly junction in Great Britain, where the far north divided into two lines, to Thurso and to Wick. A railway between these two towns, the only ones of any consequence in the area, was originally proposed in 1866 as the Caithness Railway, but it became incorporated in the scheme to link the area to Inverness, and the system was opened in 1874. 10 years later, this became part of the Highland Railway. The lines to Wick and Thurso remain open today. The final quarter of the 19th century was to see the last part of the story of the expansion of main line railways. The northwestern part of the Highlands was the last area of the United Kingdom to be fought over by the great railways, and by the end of the century, 3 of the Scottish companies were to reach the western shores to serve the Western Isles. The first of these was the Highland, in the form of the Dingwall and Skye Railway. In 1880, it opened a line from a junction with the Far North Line at Dingwall to Strome Ferry at the eastern end of Loch Carron. Much of the finance for this railway was supplied by the Caledonian Railway, although the line was worked by the Highland. Unusually for the Scottish railways, these two were allies. The Dingwall and Skye was originally to have been built to serve Kyle of Loch Arch, and from there, via a ferry, the Isle of Skye. As so often happened, lack of finance forced it to build the temporary terminus at Strome Ferry. It was to reach Kyle in the last decade of the century, as a result of the opening up of the battleground by the North British Railway. The story starts in 1865, when the North British gained access to Glasgow by acquiring the Edinburgh and Glasgow Railway, which had acquired lines on the north bank of the River Clyde some 3 years earlier. This led to the North British seeking to expand its operations and to the proposal for a route to serve the Western Isles and Inverness. The threat to its monopoly caused the Highland Railway to complete its line to Kyle of Loch Arch, an extremely complicated and costly route alongside Loch Carron, opened in 1897. From then on, this was the main link to the north part of Skye, and the railway remains at Kyle today. At about the same time as the Skye Railway was promoted, the Caledonian Railway, equally anxious to expand into the lower West Highlands, backed a railway from its branch at Callander due west to Oban, situated on the southeastern shore of the Firth of Lorne, and serving as the ferry port for the Isle of Mull. However, the Callander and Oban, like the Skye Line, was an independent concern, and despite the Caledonians' backing, its heavy engineering, especially through Glen Ogle, drained its resources. By 1870, it had only laid 17 miles of track. It managed to raise further finance to build another 15 miles of line, but had to abandon the route to Oban beyond Tindrum. There it remained in the middle of nowhere, serving only desolate countryside until, after another 4 years, it raised further capital and a new act to reach Oban in 1880. The Callander and Oban was subsequently absorbed by the Caledonian, and its one branch to Ballachulish from Conwell Ferry was opened in the last decade. The massive junction station here was out of all proportion to the importance of the branch, which brought the Caledonian to within 15 miles of Fort William. To be the principal terminus of the last of the railways in the West Highlands, the West Highland Railway itself. This was the railway eventually built by the North British, which caused the completion of the other 2 lines. It crossed the Callander and Oban Railway at Crean Lerch and formed a south-to-north route from Glasgow to the Western Isles, opening in 1894. The first proposal for a railway along this route had been made nearly half a century earlier, at the height of the mania in 1845. However, the three proposals were wildly optimistic and failed to attract investment. The tortuous history of the Callander and Oban illustrated the problems associated with opening up the West Highlands. But by 1880, when it reached Oban, the tragic situation of the people of the area was just beginning to make itself felt in the higher echelons of power at Westminster. A Crofters Commission was set up, and its members dispatched to the West Highlands on a fact-finding mission. Whilst the commissioners were preparing their reports, a proposal was put forward for a 167-mile line from Glasgow to Inverness via Loch Lomond. This was the Glasgow and North Western Railway, with financial backing from London promoters and the promise by the North British to work it. It was this that galvanised the Caledonian and Highland railways, and a long parliamentary battle ensued. In addition to the railways, steamer interests, the Caledonian Canal Commissioners and landowners were ranged against it. After 2 months of consideration, the bill was rejected, and the proposal had to lapse in 1883. However, the Crofters Commission reported that lack of transport was the main cause of the West Highland difficulties and urged improvements. In 1889, a further proposal was put forward, this time originating in Fort William, for a railway from the North British branch to Helensburgh on the Clyde, through Glenfalloch and Crianlarich, and then over the top of the desolate Rannoch Moor, before striking back southwest to Fort William. As this was not a through line to Inverness, there was less opposition, except both the Highland and Caledonian again tried to kill it off. The latter pointed to its Ballachulish branch as a suitable alternative route to Fort William, which it said could be built at a third of the cost of the new line. But the bill was passed, and the magnificent West Highland over Rannoch Moor was built, and opened in 1894, operated by the North British. Just 8 days before its opening, a West Highland Extension Act was passed, approving the construction of a further railway from Fort William to Mallig, a small port on the seacoast opposite the southern end of Skye. The Mallig extension was the last major railway to be built. It opened in 1901, on the 1st of April, perhaps appropriately in view of its history and the lack of any major traffic potential, for it never made any money for its promoters or the North British. But it still survives today and still sees steam trains on the most successful steam operation run by British Rail. Today, the railways of the Highlands are part of ScotRail, the creation of British Rail and one of the first areas to be offered for franchise under the government's proposals for privatisation. All the lines to Mallig, Oban, Kyle of Lochash and the far north are worked by sprinter units, and are probably as successful as they ever have been. Throughout the British Railways era, the search for economies has continued. As we've seen, diesels appeared early on in the 1950s. Type 2 diesels from the Birmingham Railway Carriage and Wagon Company, later British Rail classes 26 and 27, were especially associated with the country, all eventually being based there. This is one of the last to operate, seen on the East Coast Main Line near Preston Pans. Glasgow's railway workshops and depots were built up during the steam era, becoming world famous. This is Eastfield Works in Glasgow, overhauling Class 26 diesels. Glasgow's North British Locomotive Company became suppliers of locomotives to the world, as well as to many British railways, and the sight of steam engines being transported through the city centre for export from the Clyde was one of the sights of Glasgow. But the great company was unable to adapt when steam locomotion was ousted by diesels and electrics throughout the world. Despite producing a number of modern machines, it went the way of the steam engine and into liquidation. Modernisation of the railways continued into the 1980s and 90s and led to the abandonment of many of the traditional locomotive workshops and depots throughout the British Rail era. Eastfield closed in 1992, and the early diesel classes such as these Class 20s reached the end of their lives at the same time as freight traffic plummeted. Passenger diesel classes were eliminated during the 1980s, when the government authorised British Rail to modernise passenger workings by substituting multiple unit sprinter trains for the traditional locomotive and coaches formations. However, the Highland lines are still subject to seasonal traffic variations, and in the summer months, locomotives are still to be seen on the railways, such as the old Highland Main Line. In city areas, passenger transport executives were created to finance local transport. In Scotland, the Strathclyde PTE was set up to operate Glasgow's suburban systems, and adopted a bold orange and brown livery, as displayed on this unit. Scotland also sees trains operated by the most successful part of British Rail, Intercity. Both the West and East Coast main lines have been electrified, the West Coast in the 1970s and the East Coast at the end of the 1980s. For many years, the West Coast route was the principal Anglo-Scottish main line, but in 1991, the line from Carstairs to Edinburgh was electrified, and East Coast electrics were enabled to run directly from Edinburgh to Glasgow. Old rivalries appeared likely to rise again, as the East Coast line was one of the first to be offered for franchise, whilst the former North British line from Edinburgh to Glasgow belongs to ScotRail, and has been modernised with Class 158 sprinter units. Once again, travel between Scotland's two major cities can be on either of two modern railways. Modern railway history in Wales is rather different. The 1980s and early 1990s saw the decimation of the coal industry, and with it the reduction in the South Wales railway network. Most of the local passenger services were withdrawn in the Beeching era, leaving the railways to serve the collieries as they had been conceived to do. Once again, however, there was a change in attitudes to railways, and as the collieries closed, local authorities were encouraged to support the railways. In the 1980s, a number of passenger services underwritten by the authorities were reinstated on railways that had lost their passenger services many years before, at the same time as the coal trains were withdrawn. Trains still run up the main valleys, and places such as Tondee, isolated from the passenger map for many years, are again connected to Cardiff and the main line along the south of Wales. This main line is operated by Intercity and is still part of the Great Western Main Line from Paddington, operated by high-speed diesel trains. No plans have been drawn up for electrification, but the line was an early contender for privatisation. In North Wales, the former LNWR main line is also operated by HSTs, but the line had been designated as the main trunk line to serve Northern Ireland when the Channel Tunnel was opened, and electrification plans have been mooted. Once again, however, imminent privatisation of the railways in the mid-1990s had put the prospect on hold, and our history of Britain's railways draws to a close at the time when British Rail itself was to come to an end. A new chapter was about to be opened up, but that would have to be the subject of a future programme.